It was always the goal to stop relying on tracking calories eventually. I just assumed it would be a systematic, weaned approach, a phased transition away from using an app to gradual reliance and trust on the habits alone, and something that coaching would support me in achieving. Instead, my wife and I landed in Asia. I pulled up one of those tiny little stalls at a street food stand, and I looked at this bowl of food in front of me, and my brain was just whirring, thinking, how can I get this to fit into the paradigm of using MyFitnessPal? And it dawned on me then that I couldn't, because I simply didn't know what the bowl in front of me contained. And that was it. Without an app, targets, structure, we started our 8-month trip backpacking across Asia and New Zealand. And I just had to figure it out. Yet I still came home in shape. So this video is about breaking down exactly how I did that. Literally the principles and frameworks that I fell back on when calorie counting became impossible, and what the whole trip taught me about what calorie tracking is actually useful for. I lost 15 kilos tracking calories to the point where it became pretty much obsessive. Yet after 8 months of backpacking, immersed in some of the best food culture in the world, I still managed to come home in shape. Better shape than I expected, actually. And you might be surprised to hear that this isn't going to be an anti-tracking video, because I still use it when it suits my goals. But what this trip did teach me was the difference between using calorie tracking as a tool and feeling stuck doing it as a dependency. And if you're already sat there wondering what the principles look like in reality, I've put together a one-pager for you, and it's linked in the description below. It's exactly how my wife Jasmine and I approached 8 months without using an app. So I should probably start with the state that I left in, which was having deep dived into the rabbit hole of health in response to Jasmine's cancer diagnosis, combined with the desire to control whatever it was that I could. Outside of that, that had pushed tracking calories from just something standard day to day to something that had become sort of borderline obsessive. And the trouble was, I didn't really have a plan of action to get out the other side. I was packing kitchen scales to go visit my parents at the weekend. Eating out felt like something that I had to navigate as opposed to something that I could enjoy. Literally the stress of it all, I, I ended up with shingles at the age of 29. Basically, I left this trip a ball of anxiety, burnt out and borderline orthorexic. And then we landed in Bangkok. Street food everywhere, which was pretty much the entire point of the trip. And yeah, you sat there facing a bowl of broth, some protein, herbs, spices, but obviously no no macro breakdown or barcode that you could scan to whack in your MyFitnessPal. I couldn't tell you how it was cooked or what the portions of everything included were, and there was clearly no way of tracking that stuff. So this was the moment really where it became clear that tracking wasn't going to serve me for the rest of this trip. And yeah, that was the moment. Street food and Asia had ended tracking for the time being. And to be honest with you, my initial reaction was that deep pit of stomach anxiety, because the fear that I'd left for this trip with of undoing everything was there and potentially becoming a reality in front of my eyes, right? And I think this is probably quite a common thing that people feel, because in light of everything that had gone on in the last year or two, tracking felt like one of those things that I could control, and having that taken away from me felt like I was just losing control entirely. But this was a forced pivot, because out of necessity that crutch was removed, and I had no choice but to rely on the stuff that I knew. And this took shape over the coming months as we found our groove a little bit when it came to the travelling. But it typically sort of came down to these things. 2 meals a day. Uh, that was partly by design, but also largely down to budget. And then snacks were kind of on top of that. So the first meal, or one of those 2 meals, was typically protein forward. So protein was the priority, and the hope was that we would bulk it out with non-starchy vegetables and get a decent nutrient hit for that day, budget permitting. And then the second meal was usually the indulgence. So generally speaking, that was probably something that we'd researched, and that would be like the local delicacy, the something that felt really, really worth it for that area. And the outcome of that was that we were really enjoying the meals that we were having, but there was no guilt involved. And as I say, snacks were case by case. So the first barrier was, could we actually afford the thing? And if it passed that test, then it was a case of, is it actually worth us spending the money on it anyway? And this kind of applied to liquid calories as well. Neither of us are big boozers, so we tended not to spend on drinks unless it felt it was going to be really special. And then outside of food came the movement side of things. So we basically walked everywhere. We did originally plan to set up an Instagram where we would be logging our honeymoon, and that didn't really pan out. And that was called the Fumbling Foodies. But we joke that an alternative name for that could have been We'll Walk for Food, because that's pretty much how we do holidays. So getting loads of steps in was sort of priority number one. And then pretty much every day I did some sort of body weight workout, generally speaking, in the morning using a simple timer app. And all in all, that just meant we were eating the local food, we were enjoying it, and that was one of the main things we wanted to get out of the trip. And as a result, we weren't feeling deprived and setting ourselves up for regret or compensatory behaviours later. And I think the big takeaway from the trip really was the reframing of where tracking sort of sat in the grand scheme of things, because the time I'd spent tracking wasn't problematic or a waste of time. It was where the foundations had been built, because you don't go 3, 6, 12 months tracking all your meals without starting to see what reasonable portions are, what adequate protein is on a plate, what a balanced meal looks like. That stuff gets internalized if you're actually engaging in the process rather than just tracking numbers on autopilot. All Asia had done was forced a test of whether I'd actually taken any of that stuff in, or whether I'd just been logging numbers with nothing going on up there. And the result was that I came home in shape. I had lost weight, which was not the actual target, but if you'd seen how thin the daily budget was, you wouldn't be surprised by that fact. But every bowl of pho, pad thai, street food morsel, unique snack that's different from stuff that we would get in the UK, all that stuff had been eaten and thoroughly enjoyed. And a lot of that came down to what tracking had taught me before the apps became useless. And that's a common thread through my approach to coaching, because I see tracking as a tool. It's part of the process and the education. It's not something that you're sentenced to for life. The goal from the very beginning is the freedom to choose what works for you. It's that agency as opposed to a dependency on an app or me. So that time spent tracking is there to help teach you what a sustainable, healthy approach to nutrition looks like, so that if and when the time comes, you can just close MyFitnessPal if that's what you want to do, and know that you can trust the foundations that you've built and your understanding and what you've learned along the way. Backpacking was kind of an accidental graduation for me. So my coaching is there to provide more of a structured, intentional, dare I say, planned journey, rather than the chaos and stress of just going cold turkey in Southeast Asia. And just to caveat that, I'm not sitting here saying that everyone should just give up tracking and winging it, because going cold turkey only worked for me because the foundations were solid, right? If the principles weren't up here already and tracking was the only thing that was holding any sort of structure to my approach to nutrition, then going cold turkey would have been an absolute car crash. So the actual takeaway is that make sure that your time spent tracking is building something, it's contributing to your learning, it's not just stop tracking entirely, because that's ultimately what's going to get you to this place of freedom where you can choose if and when you want to apply these tools. Yeah, if you want to see what I do day to day, how I train, what I eat, the phase relevant strategies, my meals, that's all stuff that you can find over on Instagram at Charlie's Food and Fitness. So feel free to give that a follow. And if you're finding these videos useful, then give this a like and subscribe to the channel, because my aspiration is to keep producing these, but I don't know how many hits my ego can take. And just a last reminder that the travel balance principles are still linked below if you want that framework. It is exactly how I stayed in shape and what my wife and I did for the duration of our trip.